Hi, I'm Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is very briefly going to look at how mechanized farming in the United States transformed the country from an agrarian society to a much more urban and industrial society. For the purpose of this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio. If you happen to not live in Ohio, I'm sure that your state probably has some similar standards that you can use. So when we talk about farming in the United States, we're kind of talking about two different time periods, pre-mechanized farming and then mechanized farming. So in the early 1800s, and before that, of course, farming was done mostly through the use of manual labor, utilizing simple machines and tools, as well as hopefully some animal power. Well, farming like this has a lot of limitations. Number one, it's very inefficient. It also is very slow. People just don't work that fast, and they can only work so much. By farming without technology, you're going to ultimately produce less. There's only so much land you can work each and every day, and there's only so many hours in a day. So farmers are limited, and their production is not going to be as high as it could be through the use of technology. Farming like this is also much more expensive. Having to pay people and having to pay that labor cost will keep your prices high. Speaking of high prices, as slow as you're planting and harvesting, the amount of labor that it costs you, your prices are going to remain very high as your yield is relatively low. And like I said, it requires a lot of manual labor. So what is going to happen as we shift from this manual labor to mechanized farming? So as we get into the 1850s and 60s and beyond, and as technology develops, we're going to see more and more technology on our farms. Technology that will both plant and harvest, water, irrigation systems, things like that. Mechanized farming is going to have a lot of benefits. It is going to be much more efficient. It's going to be much faster. It is going to allow you to farm more land and therefore produce more food and produce more goods. After the initial investment in your technology, you're going to ultimately lower your costs, which is going to allow you to lower your prices, which means you can sell to a wider audience of people. And at the end of the day, it's also going to require less labor. So the amount of people working on our farms are going to be greatly reduced. For example, on our farm, we have 9 farmers that work for us. Well, those 9 farmers produce 7 bushels of corn, let's say, a day. But if we replace some of those farmers with a piece of technology like this harvester, for example, those 3 farmers working with one harvester could potentially produce 70 bushels of corn per day. So with less labor, we're producing more food, and that's good. So if we were to use some census data, let's see what kind of money farmers are investing in terms of machinery on these farms. So in 1850, the total investment in farm machinery was around $151 million. Within 10 years, we're going to increase that by almost $100 million up to $246. By 1880, we're going to almost double that up to $406 million, and by the turn of the century, almost doubling it again up to $749 million. So this information, this data tells us that more and more machinery was being used on our farms, which is going to help us significantly transition into this more modern era. So what are we to do with our farmers who are being replaced by this technology on the farms? Well, sorry guys, but you're going to probably have to go off to some place like New York City, a growing, developing urban area where you're probably going to have to find a job in a factory and get paid a wage and live in an apartment. So these guys are going to be leaving the farms and heading to the cities. For example, New York City's population is going to grow significantly, and by 1880 is the first city in the United States to cross that 1 million person threshold. So New York City is a great example of how these urban areas are going to grow due to this influx of people. And if we begin to look at our population numbers in the United States, in 1850, only 15% of the population lived in an urban area. By 1900, we're up to 40% of the US population living in urban areas. And by 1920, 51%. Now the majority of Americans live in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. So to summarize this lesson, mechanized farming is going to transition farming, it's going to improve farming, it's going to improve the production of farms, it's going to reduce the cost of farm goods, but it's also going to replace manual labor. Machines replace workers. Those workers are going to have to move from those agrarian rural areas into urban industrialized areas as they seek jobs and employment. Thanks for watching this video lesson. I hope you learned something.